Assalamu alaikum students, this is Farwa Batul, your O-level computer science instructor, and welcome to another video of chapter number 8 programming. We have started the count control loops and we are done with Python as my programming language to use the count control loops. Now in this video, I'm particularly talking about Visual Basic as my programming language in order to use a count control loop. So here we will be using for loop. Why is a for loop known as a count control loop? Why? Because the number of iterations, remember that in a count control loop, the number of iterations are fixed. So you actually know that how many times the line of code that is inside your loop is going to repeat. The repetition has a fixed value. Okay, so let me just quickly give you an example. Let's suppose you want to print your name 5 times. So here the iterations must go from 1 till 5. Since the iterations are fixed, so you can use for loop. Now let me quickly go to the syntax that we can use in Visual Basic in order to use the for loop. Okay, the first thing that you have to do is to declare an integer variable, and you can name it as counter that is going to have your iteration values. A counter is a variable that is going to have values of your iterations, the number of times you want to iterate the loop. So the counter can start from, if you want to print your name 5 times, it can have a value from 1 till 5. So every time the counter is going to increment when it is done with the previous iteration. So let's suppose you print your name for the first time, then the counter was 1. Then for the next iteration, counter becomes 2, and again it will print your name. Third time, the counter is going to increment by 3 and your name will be printed third time. In fourth iteration, counter becomes 4 and you will also see your name. And in the fifth iteration, that is your final iteration, you will see your name again. So this is how you're going to display your name 5 times in 5 iterations. So how we can do that? First of all, it is very important to declare a variable. You can name it counter in order to remember it. Otherwise, you can just name it whatever you want, X, Y, Z. So dim counter as integer. This is basically going to declare a variable that you're gonna be using for your iterations. Okay, dim counter as integer. So it can have integer value, depends upon the range that you're going to uh, assign it. So let me just quickly use the for loop here, use the for keyword for this, initiate the value of counter. You can start with 1 and you can move to, let's suppose you want 5 iterations. So make it 1, 2, 5. This is going to specify your number of iterations. This is actually the range that you are going to set. It goes from 1 till 5. So it means that 5 times your iterations will work, or the code will work 5 times that you are going to specify inside your for loop. Now let's suppose I want to give a command to print something. So let me just write down console.write line, that is an output statement that displays something on your screen. Let me just quickly write down counter here so that I can see the changes in the variable counter. And remember not to forget writing the next keyword when your for loop finishes. So at the end, it specifies the end of your for loop. So this is very, very important to write down next. So inside for and next, whatever you're gonna specify is the line of code that is going to repeat. Line of code that will iterate. The number of times the counter is set with the range. Okay, So now let me quickly just tell you that what is being done here in the output. Okay, let me just erase this. Okay, for the first time, what will happen, since you have assigned a value 1 to the counter, so it will start with a value 1 for the first iteration. Now, inside the for loop, you see that console.writeLine is your output statement, and inside the output statement, you are printing the value of counter. So let's suppose this is your output. The first value of counter to be printed is 1. You will see 1. Okay. Then the next command will run. In the next command, your counter is going to increment. So now it becomes, the counter value for the next iteration becomes 2. So you can see 2 printed on your screen. For the third iteration, you will see changes in your counter. In the third iteration, the counter value becomes 3. So you're gonna see 3 on your display screen. Then the counter becomes 4, and you are going to see 4 on your display screen. And then finally the counter value is 5, since your range is 1 till 5. So you will see 5 in your counter. And once you are done with your range 1 to 5, then for the sixth iteration, the loop will terminate. There will be no sixth iteration because the counter value is fixed, or the last value for counter is set to 5. So the counter is not increment greater than 5. So this is how you're gonna work. These are your 5 fixed iterations. Now, if you want to print your name 5 times, you just go here, and instead of writing counter inside your output statement, just write down your name in commas, quotations. So this is how you're gonna print your name 5 times. Let me just quickly see this in a Visual Basic Online Editor. So let's just go to Google and search for a VB editor. Here you can see that it's a online VB compiler. You can search on Google and you can find a lot of examples for that. I'm just using this one. So what I will do, first I will initiate inside your main function, initiate a variable named as counter, as since it is integer, it is going to have integer value. So declare the data type for it, press enter. Now the next thing is use a for loop, for, then specify the range for counter, counter equals 1, then use 2 to specify the number of iterations, 1 to 5, let's suppose. Press enter. Now here use the next command that specifies the end of your for loop. Okay, and sorry for this. Okay, now inside your for loop, you're gonna write the output statement, that is console dot write line. Okay, so INE, and then you're gonna be printing the value of counter. So let me just write down counter here. That's it. Now let me just quickly see my result. Look at the run button at the top, press this, and let's see what will happen. Okay, there is an error. It must be integer only, not VB integer. Let's run this. Okay, now if you can see, the output is basically the counter values. So here you can see that first time the counter is 1, in the second iteration it becomes 2, in the third it becomes 3, in the fourth it becomes 4, and in the fifth iteration the value of counter becomes 5. So these are total 5 iterations that you have been gone through. Now let me just quickly print my name inside that. So it will go from 1 till 5. There will be 5 iterations, or 5 times the code will run inside your for loop. Okay, look at this. So this is actually the 5 times your name is printed on the screen. Okay, so this is a very simple example of your for loop when your iterations are fixed 1 to 5. Now let me quickly tell you one more thing, that is using step keyword in your for loop. So let me go to whiteboard first. What is the step keyword? You can use the step keyword if you want to increment the counter value by 2, by 3, by 4. What it means actually, by default, if you are not using the step keyword in your for loop, then the counter is incrementing by 1 every time. What it means? It means that first it will be 1, then it becomes 2, then 3, then 4, then 5. So this is what we call, it is incremented by 1. Every time you are going to have the next consecutive integer to the counter, or plus 1 is being added to the previous value of counter. So if it is 1, it becomes 2. If it is 2, it becomes 3. If it is 3, it becomes 4. So it is when you are doing plus 1 to the counter value. So this is done by default, but if you are using the step keyword next to your range of counter, this actually helps you to increment the counter by 2 or by more than 2. What it means? It means that, let's suppose the counter has the initial value 1. Let me just change my range over here to explain you this thing. Let's make it 1 to 10. 1 to 10 is the range, or is the number of iterations for my for loop. It will go from 1 to 10. But when I write down, let's suppose step 2. So step 2 means that I have to increment the counter by 2. Incrementing by 2 means that if it has 1 in the beginning, so for the next iteration, this is in the first iteration, the counter value was set to 1. In the second iteration, instead of 2, it will become 1 plus 2, that is 3. So here, the next value of the counter to be printed will be 3. Okay, so in the third iteration, what will happen? The counter value will become 3 plus 2, that is 5. So every time you are going to have a plus 2 in the previous counter value. Why? Because you are using step keyword, and after that you specified 2, which means that increment the counter by 2. Every time you have to do plus 2 in the previous value of counter for the next iteration. So after 5, it becomes 5 plus 2, that is 7. So you will see 7 in the next iteration. In the fourth iteration, there will be 7 written on your screen, and for the counter value 7, when you increment it by 2, it becomes 9. So you will see 9 in the fifth iteration. So this is your output. Now for the next iteration, when you see that the counter value is 9, so 9 plus 2 becomes 11, and 11 is actually not coming in the range of the counter values that we have assigned. We have assigned the values to a counter from 1 till 10. So since 11 is out of your specified range, so you are not going to have any further iteration. So there will be no 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 iterations. Remember that. So actually you have to follow the range 1 till 10. Your counter value must follow this particular range. If it goes out of the range, then the iterations will stop. For the value of counter 11, 12, 13, remember that your iterations will stop. Your for loop will stop because the specified range is 1 to 10. Now let me just quickly do one more thing. Let's suppose I make it, instead of 2, I make this number 3, or I want the counter value to increment by 3. Let me just delete the unnecessary information. Let me just quickly remove all of this. To tell you one more thing, let me just make it very, very clear to you. So this time, if I want to increment my counter by 3, so I specify that after a step I have written 3, which says that you have to increment the counter value by 3. Every time you have to add 3 to its previous value. And here in your output, you are printing the value of your counter. So initially, if the counter was 1, for the first iteration, it was 1. So in the first iteration, you will see 1 on your screen. For the second iteration, it becomes 1 plus 3 equals 4. So in the second iteration, the output becomes 4. 4 is your new counter value that is stored in the variable. Okay, next to 4 is 4 plus 3. For the next iteration, 4 plus 3 becomes 7. So in the third iteration, when the code is running third time, you will see 7 on your screen. That is your new counter value. And for the fourth iteration, when it calculates the counter value, 7 plus 3 equals 10. Remember that it is also in the range 1 to 10. So you will have fourth iteration. In the fourth iteration, the counter value becomes 10. So that this is how the counter is being incremented by 3. And now if you go for the fifth iteration, once you calculate the value of your counter, 10 plus 3 becomes 13, and 13 is actually out of range. When the counter value becomes out of range, then you have to stop and exit your for loop. So there will be no more iterations. Let me quickly go to the VB editor here. I will write down the step keyword to explain you this thing. Step. I want to increment the counter value by 2, and I want my range to set from 1 to 10. So remember that the counter value will increment by 2. Let's just print the counter value. Okay. Sorry for this. Let's just quickly run the program. Let's see the counter. Yes, here we go. So the counter values are incremented. For the first time, it must be 1. Let me show from here. Yeah, it is 1 for the first time in the first iteration. Then 1 plus 2 becomes 3. Then 3 plus 2 becomes 5. 5 plus 2, 7. 7 plus 2, 9. And when 9 plus 2 is 11, then 11 is out of your range. So you are not going to have your sixth iteration. So this is how the step keyword works for you. Let me just quickly make it 3 so that you will be clear about this. Okay, this time the counter value will increment by 3. So it will be starting with 1. 1 plus 3 becomes 4. 4 plus 3, 7. 7 plus 3, 10. So you're going to be having 4 iterations. 10 plus 3 becomes 13. That is going to be out of your range specified. So this is how the step word keyword in your for loop actually works when you want to increment the counter value more than 1. Stay tuned, stay connected, and do not forget to subscribe the channel, because in the next video we are going to use the for loop by in Java as my programming language. Bye bye.